Welcome to Dialogue.
Glad to be here.
So today we are launching into a deep dive that might feel a little uncomfortable, especially if you have a lot of letters after your name, or maybe if you're working towards getting them.
It's a tricky subject. We're going to be talking about a massive paradox.
Exactly. It's this uncomfortable truth that being highly educated, highly credentialed, doesn't automatically immunize you from believing and championing some of the absolute worst ideas in history.
It's a really critical investigation because I think we all tend to operate under this assumption that, intellectual sophistication equals some kind of critical immunity.
Right.
But our sources, and really history itself, suggest the opposite. The most destructive, nonsensical, and frankly embarrassing concepts weren't cooked up by people who lacked opportunity.
No.
They were invented, peer-reviewed, funded, and championed by the most credentialed people on the planet.
We are talking about doctors, professors, economists, leading scientists, the people who literally write the textbooks.
The people who put that PhD in their bio.
Yes, like it's a shiny Pokemon badge they earned by being intellectually superior to everyone else. And yet, if you actually look at the historical record, they are responsible for some massive catastrophic errors.
And that's the core claim we're exploring today. This isn't a low IQ problem. In fact, a high intellect can sometimes make the problem worse.
How so?
Well, being highly educated doesn't just fail to immunize you from a powerful narrative. It can give you the sophisticated machinery you need to construct an incredibly elegant, dense, and persuasive defense of that flawed narrative. You just get better at rationalizing.
So our mission today is to explore why. Why do smart people cling so tightly to bad ideas? How can entire fields of study get compromised?
And what's the real social cost when you decide to step outside of that and question the established, credentialed narratives?
And we have to keep a sense of humor about this, because when you look at it, intellectual rigidity, especially at these elite levels, can be darkly comedic.
Absolutely. So the central question really is, why does this massive investment in formal knowledge, all the years of study, the intellectual rigor, so frequently fail to translate into genuine, critical, independent thought?
It sounds like it's a failure of the system itself, not necessarily a failure of individual intelligence.
That's the idea we're going to unpack.
Okay, let's get into it. So, to start, I think we have to redefine what a degree actually proves versus what we all assume it proves.
That's the foundation of this whole issue. We've all been conditioned to believe that a degree, especially a graduate degree, is a certificate of insight.
A stamp of approval for your brain.
Exactly. But the evidence strongly suggests it's something very different. A degree, particularly one that takes years to acquire, is primarily evidence of endurance.
And compliance.
Yeah.
Deep, unwavering compliance.
Yes. When you get that diploma, what you have definitively proven to the institution is your capacity to follow a very specific set of rules over a very long period of time. It's really an organizational achievement.
Right. You proved you can memorize a staggering amount of information. And let's be honest, a lot of that information is going to be revised or completely outdated in 5 or 10 years.
Of course.
You proved you can tolerate bureaucratic systems, meet deadlines that are designed for efficiency, not for discovery, and you can maintain years of structured compliance without staging an intellectual revolt.
Or even just telling a professor that their entire framework seems flawed. You learn not to do that pretty quickly.
So these are skills of discipline, of memory, of organizational management, and they're vital for running an economy, I get that. But they are not the skills of critical, independent inquiry.
No, a degree does not prove your ability to challenge deep foundational assumptions. It doesn't prove you can spot glaring internal contradictions in a theory, or to just stop and say, wait a minute, if we trace this logic back to its first premise, this whole thing collapses.
Think about how academic success actually works. You're in a classroom, you're getting graded. Let's say you're in an advanced economics class. Are you rewarded for pointing out the inherent political biases built into the foundational models? Or for dismantling the core assumptions your professor has built their entire career on?
That is a very swift path to a C- and professional exile.
Exactly. The grade, almost always, is based on the accuracy of your repetition and your integration of the material.
The system rewards how well you adopted and then repeated the prescribed framework. And look, that structure is essential for training highly specialized technicians, which is what the modern economy needs.
But it inherently rewards conformity. It actively disincentivizes the creative, disruptive dismantling of those frameworks.
And that split creates two very different mindsets. We can sort of call it the difference between a critical thinker and an educated parrot.
I like that. So what's the difference?
The critical thinker is always focused on the architecture of the idea itself. Their questions are always looking downward, at the foundation.
What are the core axioms this argument is built on, and are they even true?
Precisely. Or who benefits institutionally or financially if this idea becomes widespread? And crucially, what specific evidence would I need to see to definitively falsify this claim? They're looking for the breaking point.
And the parrot.
The educated parrot is just as smart, often with a much better memory, but their focus is entirely transactional. It's inward-looking.
So if you put them in that same economics course,
Their driving question isn't about the ethical structure of the models. Their driving question, fundamentally, is always, will this be on the exam?
right, how do I make sure I pass the final with the highest possible distinction?
The parrot learns what to think. The formula, the accepted interpretation, the methodology that gets you the good grade. The critical thinker is learning how to think, how to interrogate the formula itself.
And if your primary motivator for a decade is just passing the test to get the credential, the system trains you to prioritize adherence over genuine discovery.
And that adherence, that becomes the rigid psychological bedrock for the next, much bigger problem.
So if you spend a decade mastering the answer key, you develop a deep, almost instinctual allegiance to the key itself, whether or not the door it opens is actually leading anywhere useful.
That's a perfect way to put it. And that allegiance brings us right to the psychological barrier that highly educated people face. We can call it the identity trap.
The identity trap.
It's the uncomfortable truth that the more intellectual capital you accumulate, the higher your psychological investment is in being right.
So if you think about it, by the time someone hits their late 20s, their 30s, their whole professional identity is just inextricably linked to their specialized knowledge.
Absolutely. If you've spent 10, 15, maybe 20 years of your life dedicated to mastering a specific economic model or a therapeutic technique or a scientific theory, that knowledge isn't just objective information anymore.
It becomes who you are.
It becomes your status, your income, your professional network, your self-worth. It is the literal foundation of your entire life's structure.
So let's imagine you are a highly credentialed professor. You're tenured, well-published, sought after for talks. And then someone, maybe a grad student, walks in with contradictory evidence.
Evidence that proves the foundational premise of your life's work is flawed, or maybe even completely wrong.
If you accept that evidence, it's not just a minor correction in a footnote.
No, it means you have to face this shattering psychological reality that maybe 2 decades of your professional life, the papers, the tenure, the consulting gigs, your reputation, was all built on a fault line.
The cost is just enormous. It's not a logical cost. It's a deep existential threat to your sense of self. It's an unbearable kind of status loss.
And because the cost of being wrong is so incredibly high, it's not a debate loss, it's an identity loss. The brain pulls a defensive maneuver.
That pure, noble intellectual question, is this true? Is this evidence reliable? It just gets shoved aside.
Immediately, the mind instinctively pivots from objective discovery into an advocacy stance.
We stop thinking critically.
And we start lawyering reality.
Lawyering reality. I really like that phrase. It explains so much about institutional behavior.
It does. A lawyer's job isn't to find the objective truth. Their job is to use their formidable intellectual skills to advocate for their client.
And in this case, the client is your own established identity, your long-held beliefs. The goal shifts from truth-seeking to just winning the argument and maintaining your reputation.
And this is where the sheer intellectual power of the educated person becomes a liability.
A bug, not a feature.
Exactly. They have the cognitive machinery, the ability to rationalize, to dismiss inconvenient facts, to craft incredibly complex counter-arguments, to argue around the contradictory evidence rather than engaging with it.
A person who hasn't invested all that time and energy might just shrug and say, I guess I was wrong. That's interesting.
But the highly invested individual, they'll write a 50-page peer-reviewed paper that uses complex statistical modeling to explain why that contradictory evidence is actually misinterpreted, or methodologically unsound, or just too small of a sample size to matter.
So they don't become a less intelligent. They become expert defenders of established nonsense.
Their ability to rationalize is directly proportional to their intelligence and their professional investment. They use their intellect not to challenge the structure, but to reinforce its walls when it's under attack. And that in a nutshell, is why they become so incredibly vulnerable to adopting and defending really bad ideas.
So this psychological landscape, it just sets the perfect stage for how entire disciplines or even whole institutions can be captured by flawed concepts.
It really does. And we hear this assumption all the time, that only uneducated people fall for propaganda.
Right, that it's a problem for the uninformed masses.
But history shows that sophisticated narratives actually prefer and actively seek out the educated.
Why is that? What makes them a better target?
It's because the uneducated are fundamentally less useful to a narrative structure than a credentialed expert is.
Okay, so it's about utility.
It's all about utility. Educated individuals possess authority. They have access to the platforms, the prestigious journals, the university lecture halls, the major media outlets.
And more importantly, they can take a potentially flawed or cynical or overly simplistic idea and translate it.
Exactly. They translate it into sophisticated, respectable, authoritative academic jargon. They sanitize the air. They give it a coat of intellectual paint.
Consider the difference in impact. A lie told by an average person is pretty easily ignored. It just stays on the fringe.
But a highly questionable premise, delivered by a tenured professor, backed by institutional funding, and dressed up in complex statistical language.
That immediately gets an air of intellectual inevitability.
It moves from being a fringe idea to becoming accepted curriculum, and from there, eventually, policy.
This is where we run into what you might call the sacred cows of every academic discipline.
Every single field has them. These are the dogmas, the untouchable foundational assumptions that everyone in the field just takes for granted.
Physics has them. Economics is built on them. Psychology has its models that are considered sacrosanct.
And you spend your entire academic career mastering how to use these sacred cows. You don't even notice their assumptions because you're too busy memorizing and applying them.
So they only become visible when someone challenges them.
Usually a junior researcher who hasn't built their career on them yet, or maybe an external critic. Someone who dares to question them directly.
And what happens when that challenge occurs?
The consequences are immediate, they are systemic, and they are professionally devastating.
Suddenly, the researchers grant funding, which is essential for their work. It just dries up.
Their papers that used to sail through peer review now face this relentless, hypercritical scrutiny. Invitations to speak at major conferences, which are critical for advancement, suddenly stop coming.
And colleagues who used to be friendly and supportive, now they professionally distance themselves.
Right. And the dissenter gets quickly and effectively labeled with these corporate speak terms like problematic, controversial, or not collaborative.
And this is the critical mechanism, isn't it? When an idea is defended not through open, rational debate with evidence, but through immediate institutional and social punishment, that's no longer science.
That is, as someone put it, theology with lab coats.
Theology with lab coats. I love that. The institution is just functioning to protect a cherished belief and an established hierarchy, not to test a hypothesis. The goal has shifted entirely from discovery to defense.
Which brings us to that rhetorical shield we hear so often,
Right.
Trust the experts.
We're taught that experts are these neutral sources of pure, objective truth.
But we have to remember that experts are fundamentally human beings operating within complex, flawed human systems. They're not floating brains delivering pure data from the ether.
They're incentivized. Their entire career, from tenure to publication, depends on getting certain findings or conforming to certain institutional norms.
They're politically constrained, they're dependent on their employers, the universities, government agencies, and they're profoundly susceptible to social pressure from their peer group, which is what dictates their status.
When you really look at the system they're in, you realize the system's highest priority is self-preservation.
Systems prioritize rewarding conformity, protecting the institution's reputation at all costs, punishing dissenters to maintain stability, and, maybe most critically, preserving the massive funding streams that allow the whole system to exist and expand.
So when a public figure or a major news outlet delivers that line, all experts agree on this matter.
What they often mean, if you look beneath the surface and follow the money, is something much more pragmatic and, frankly, a bit chilling.
It's all experts who are still employed, still receiving grants, and still being invited to the prestigious journals agree on this matter.
The system is self-filtering. It doesn't need to debate the dissenter. It just needs to make sure the dissenter doesn't have a job or a platform. The agreement, you see, is often just an artifact of that filtration process, not an immutable statement of fact.
Okay, so if individual experts are vulnerable because of this identity trap, and institutions are designed to protect themselves, how does a truly bad, maybe even nonsensical idea actually seize control of an entire professional field.
It happens through a remarkably consistent three-step process. And this mechanism is so powerful because it bypasses the logical firewall of a highly intelligent person.
It doesn't attack them with logic.
No. It always begins with step one, the introduction of a moral narrative.
Every successful institutional capture starts with something that sounds undeniably noble. It has to be wrapped in the highest ideals that no one could possibly argue against without looking like a monster.
Phrases like, think of the children, think of safety, think of equality and inclusion, or this is essential for progress.
Once an idea is successfully framed through that powerful moral lens, the entire nature of the conversation just fundamentally shifts.
It's no longer subject to rigorous intellectual scrutiny based on whether it's true or false or if the data supports it. It's now judged entirely on a moral axis. Is it good or evil?
And the second, an idea transitions from being a factual claim into a moral imperative, critical thinking dies instantly.
The highly intelligent person's critical faculties just shut down because to challenge the idea means accepting a moral label.
If you question a policy framed around safety, you're immediately labeled as someone who doesn't care about safety.
If you challenge an initiative framed around equity, you're accused of being biased or unjust. The moralization of the argument is the Trojan horse that silences the internal skeptic.
Most people, especially educated professionals who value their social standing, just can't withstand that social pressure of being labeled morally deficient. They'd rather accept a flawed premise than accept the label.
Which sets the stage for step two, which often happens at the same time, redefining language.
This is the mechanism that allows the narrative to evolve and become self-sealing, making empirical evidence basically irrelevant.
The institutions slowly but surely change the definitions of core concepts over time.
We see this with words that used to have specific quantifiable definitions. Words like harm, violence, equity, safety.
Exactly. Historically, violence required physical force. Harm required demonstrably measurable damage. The institutional effort is to stretch these definitions until they include subjective offense or disagreement.
For example, if you define safety not just as physical protection, but as emotional safety from uncomfortable or challenging ideas, you've just created a very powerful new tool.
Now, a simple logical disagreement or presenting contradictory evidence can be successfully redefined as unsafe.
And the result of that is profoundly powerful for suppressing dissent among the educated classes.
If those definitions are successfully broadened, then disagreement is instantly redefined as harmful. Questioning established concepts becomes a form of violence.
And empirical evidence that directly contradicts the moral narrative can be dismissed as offensive or triggering or hate speech.
And once that linguistic shift is achieved, the institution doesn't need to refute its critics logically. That takes effort and risks being wrong.
They can just silence them using the language of moral transgression. They can say, we cannot engage with that harmful line of questioning, or that evidence is offensive to our mission.
The debate is over before it even begins, and the high IQ person is trapped because they rely on language for their work.
Which leads right into the final step.
Step 3. Capturing the gatekeepers. Once the moral and linguistic foundations are laid, the bad ideas become institutionalized stupidity once they're accepted by the core professional bodies that dictate standards and control access.
We're talking about the key choke points here. They're prestigious academic journals that control publication and certify what's legitimate.
The universities that control tenure, curricula, and degrees. The accreditation boards that define what it means to be a professional in fields like medicine or psychology.
And critically, the government and corporate funding agencies that decide who gets the money to do the research in the first place.
Once these gatekeepers align on the narrative, on the moral imperative and the new definitions, they act as a powerful insulated filter. It doesn't even need a formal conspiracy. It just needs internal consistency.
So the peer review process is now conducted by people who already believe the narrative. They'll just reject research that doesn't support it as methodologically weak or lacking appropriate consideration for safety guidelines.
And that creates this echo chamber where only supportive research gets published, only compliant students advance to get their degrees and grants, and only aligned ideas survive.
The system begins to feed itself exclusively with supporting evidence, creating a circular logic that looks, from the outside, like an overwhelming consensus.
And that's how intellectual rot becomes professional bedrock.
Yeah,
Okay, now for the really critical and necessary historical perspective. This process of institutionalized stupidity has played out so many times before.
And looking at these examples should trigger a deep sense of humility about whatever the current consensus is. We need to look at ideas that were once taught, respected, peer-reviewed, and professionally endorsed by the most educated people, only to become, well, a source of historical mockery.
The list is long, and it's worth slowing down to appreciate the depth of these errors. Let's start with bloodletting.
Right, and this wasn't some ancient, forgotten folk remedy. For over 2,000 years, from Hippocrates all the way through the 19th century, highly credentialed doctors, the best medical minds in the world, believed that draining a patient's blood was the cure for almost everything.
Fevers, gout, you name it. And think about the intellectual sophistication required to defend that practice. They wrote entire, dense medical texts filled with complex theories about humors and balances to justify it.
And when a patient died after being bled, the doctor didn't question the procedure.
No, they concluded the patient must have been bled too little or too late. The methodology itself was never questioned by the establishment. The expert just lawyered the reality around the fatal outcome.
The more educated you were, the more committed you were to this lethal nonsense. If you were a self-taught country doctor who suggested maybe the patient needed rest and food, you were dismissed as ignorant and unscientific.
Because bloodletting was the settled consensus. Questioning it was seen as questioning science itself.
Okay, or how about phrenology in the 19th century?
Oh, a classic. The academic idea that the shape and the bumps on your skull determined your personality, your intelligence, your moral character.
And this wasn't a joke. Phrenology generated entire professional societies, prestigious books, specialized clinics in major cities.
It was taught in elite universities as a serious branch of psychology and anatomy. And why did smart people believe it? Because it provided a scientific-sounding rationale, a pseudo-biological framework to categorize and justify existing social biases about race, class, and criminality.
It let educated people feel morally superior while hiding behind this veneer of empirical observation, even though the evidence was completely non-existent.
And then, perhaps the most chilling example of this kind of intellectual capture is eugenics in the early 20th century.
The belief that the human race could be improved through selective breeding, which led to mass compulsory sterilization programs and justified horrific policies.
And again, this was not a fringe political movement.
No, it was championed by leading biologists, geneticists, economists, progressive thinkers. It was funded by major philanthropic organizations like the Carnegie Institution. It was taught as a mandatory course in high schools and universities.
And why? Because the highly educated elite convinced themselves that this was the ultimate rational scientific solution to social problems. It gave them an intellectual justification for managing the population in what they saw as the most efficient way. They used their credentials to morally authorize tyranny.
And we can't forget lobotomies.
A procedure where parts of the brain were destroyed to treat mental illness. The physician who pioneered the practice, Antonio Egas Moniz, won the Nobel Prize for it.
A Nobel Prize. In 1949. Think about the political and scientific machinery required to award the highest possible scientific honor for what we now recognize as barbaric, destructive brain damage.
It's proof that the idea had captured the ultimate institutional gatekeeper. At the time, if you suggested there might be a better, non-invasive way to treat depression, you were standing against the established, Nobel-validated scientific consensus.
And there are more recent examples. The decades-long, professionally endorsed belief that smoking was healthy, promoted by doctors and medical journals.
Or the disastrous trend of repressed memory therapy. Highly educated psychologists with full institutional support led thousands of patients to believe they had recovered traumatic memories that were often completely false, which caused immense family destruction.
Or something as mundane as the food pyramid. For decades, that was a universal piece of government-endorsed science taught in every school, integrated into every diet plan.
And it has since been revealed to be structurally flawed, often based more on political lobbying from the agricultural industry favoring grains, downplaying fats, than on actual unbiased health science. The experts were just following the money and the established consensus.
So the key takeaway here is that at the time these ideas were accepted, questioning them was not seen as critical thinking.
No, it was seen as being anti-science, anti-progress, or just plain ignorant. The dissenters were the Luddites.
Which brings us to what might be the most rhetorically dangerous phrase used in academia and public life: the consensus is settled.
That phrase has aged terribly every single time it has been deployed throughout human history. It isn't a statement of ultimate truth. It's a rhetorical tool used by institutions to shut down inquiry and protect power.
Consensus once settled on the idea that the sun revolved around the earth. Dissent was met with persecution or death.
Absolute medical authority was once certain that germs didn't exist, leading to horrifying sanitation and surgical practices.
Consensus once justified the deeply harmful belief that women or certain races were biologically inferior, providing the foundation for generations of oppression.
Consensus is not truth. It is merely a snapshot of who controls the funding, who controls the journals, and who has the institutional weight at a specific moment in time. History remembers who was right, not who was credentialed or popular.
So, if the history of expert error is so brutally clear, why do institutions and the people running them work so hard today to suppress genuine, evidence-based dissent?
Well, it really boils down to a fundamental concept. Critical thinkers are simply inconvenient.
Inconvenient.
Very. Institutions, whether it's a major university, a government agency, or a large corporation, they prize stability, predictability, optics, and control above all else. They are large, complex systems designed for efficient management, not for philosophical anarchy or chaotic debate.
So, a genuine critical thinker is an organizational hazard.
A huge one. They slow down processes because they ask too many uncomfortable why and what if questions. They expose contradictions in established, publicly visible policies, which threatens the institution's reputation.
And most dangerously, they threaten the established reputations and careers of the powerful people who champion those now flawed ideas in the first place.
So instead of being rewarded for intellectual rigor, the critical thinker is quickly flagged within the system. They get labeled.
Difficult, controversial, not collaborative.
Or, my personal favorite, the most subtle but professionally devastating corporate speak, not a team player.
Not a team player. That's the classic institutional translation for your independent thought is making our lives harder, it's slowing down our processes, and it's forcing us to think about things we already decided were settled.
And the system has a highly effective, low-effort way of dealing with these individuals, which almost never requires engaging with their arguments on a logical level.
And this is the ultimate lesson for any potential dissenter out there.
Institutions rarely need to disprove a critical thinker logically.
They only need to employ social and professional punishment. They just need to shame them publicly, suggest they're acting in bad faith, or are secretly motivated by some ideology.
They need to isolate them from their professional networks, mock their suggestions in internal meetings, and question their motives, suggesting they're just trying to be disruptive instead of pursuing truth.
And this strategy is so ruthlessly effective because it exploits our deepest human fear.
Most people, even those with incredibly high IQs and impeccable credentials, don't truly fear being proven wrong in a logical debate.
They fear isolation.
They fear being alone, losing their status, professional ostracization. The risk of being intellectually right is often much less terrifying than the risk of being socially wrong.
The moment that challenging an idea means risking your reputation, your friendships, your livelihood, your tenure, the vast majority of people, regardless of their intellect, will choose conformity.
They just decide that the cost of integrity is too high. And so social punishment becomes the single most powerful tool for maintaining a false consensus, even if that consensus is demonstrably riddled with flaws. So for you, for the listener, how do we navigate this world of credentialed conformity and these institutional filters?
It seems like the first step is to internalize the fact that thinking critically is a skill. It's something you cultivate through deliberate practice and discomfort. It's not a status that's conferred on you by a tuition check or a diploma.
Exactly. A critical thinker's habits are fundamentally different from someone who just mastered a syllabus. First and foremost, they consciously separate their identity from their ideas.
So being proven wrong isn't a personal indictment or a public humiliation.
It's an opportunity for genuine learning and revision. They have to be willing to be wrong.
They also actively engage in what philosophers call metacognition. They're constantly asking themselves that really hard question: what specific evidence, if it were presented to me, would fundamentally change my mind about this?
And if the honest answer to that is nothing could change my mind, they have to recognize they're no longer operating in the realm of inquiry. They've entered the realm of dogma.
They also have to practice steel-manning opposing viewpoints. Can you explain that?
Sure. Straw manning is when you find the weakest, most ridiculous version of a criticism to easily tear down. Steel manning is the opposite. It requires you to present the strongest, most coherent, most intellectually formidable version of the opposing argument.
So you ensure you're arguing against the best possible version of the contrary evidence. Only then do you really test your own beliefs.
And critically, a true independent thinker has a profound, healthy distrust for arguments that are rooted primarily in moral outrage.
So if the main rhetorical tool being used to enforce an idea is shame or indignation or suggesting that your opposition is morally evil,
The critical thinker immediately flags that as a mechanism designed to bypass logic and activate fear. They prioritize coherence over popularity. They ask, is this coherent? Not, is this popular or institutionally acceptable?
we can probably provide a final, definitive litmus test that you can apply immediately to any idea presented by any authority figure, no matter how impressive their resume is.
Okay, there are 4 crucial questions. You should ask them slowly and deliberately.
First, can this core idea, this foundational assumption, be questioned openly within the professional sphere, in a journal, a university forum, a conference, without immediate automatic professional reprisal?
Second, can evidence that contradicts this idea logically exist, or has the framework been so tightly constructed, maybe through that linguistic redefinition we talked about, that any contradictory data is just dismissed or redefined as misinformation or harmful speech?
Third, are the critics of this idea engaged in genuine, good-faith intellectual debate by the institution? Or are they immediately and personally attacked, mocked, isolated, and subjected to relentless character assassination?
And finally, does disagreement with this idea cost people their careers, their livelihoods, their tenure, or their professional standing?
And if the answer to that last question is an unequivocal yes, you have to draw a defining line.
If questioning an idea ruins lives, it is not science, it is ideology. And it is being enforced by the institutional use of social and economic fear. And if history teaches us anything reliable, it is that the humiliation cycle is absolutely inevitable.
It's a certainty that some ideas currently being taught today, championed by highly educated people at elite institutions, published in the most prestigious journals, will be viewed as absolute cringeworthy nonsense in 70 to 50 years.
Think about the curriculum being taught right now, the therapeutic models being used, the economic theories guiding policy. Your grandchildren are going to look back at today's settled narrative, and they will scratch their heads and ask that simplest, most devastating question.
They believed what?
And here's the profound irony of this cycle. The people who will be retroactively memorialized in those future history books, the ones who saw the error, who noticed the contradiction and refused to conform, they'll be labeled brave, visionary, courageous ahead of their time.
But what is their reality today?
Today, those same independent thinkers are being called dangerous, ignorant, uneducated, conspiracy theorists, or just evil. They're the ones being socially isolated and professionally punished.
The cycle proves that intellectual integrity comes with an immense cost in the present, a cost that only future generations who are safely removed from the power structure will ever validate.
The challenge of critical thinking is that it requires an incredible amount of patience and a high tolerance for being uncomfortable and alone. It requires the willingness to stand in the immediate moment, mocked and sidelined, for an eventual validation that might only come long after your career has been compromised or even ended.
So we have to fundamentally divorce 3 concepts in our minds to become true critical thinkers. Education does not equal intelligence.
Degrees do not equal wisdom.
And credentials, no matter how shiny or expensive, do not equal truth.
Critical thinking is lonely. It's uncomfortable. It's risky. But if we look at the historical record, one fact remains utterly clear. The people who choose to think independently are the ones who are mocked first and memorialized later. They are the ones who actually advanced human knowledge.
Everyone else, the great masses of the compliant and the credentialed, they simply had really nice resumes. They had the paperwork that proved their loyalty and their capacity for adherence, but they lack the essential skill of questioning the premise.
And that is the absolute difference between being merely educated and actually thinking.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.